And I want to welcome everyone to this morning's presentation of BOS200 applications with LNAPL. If you have questions during the presentation, you can email those to Bob at Trap and Treat. Selected questions, we'll try to answer as many questions at the conclusion of the webinar as possible. So over the years, there's been considerable discussion regarding absorption capacity and bioavailability of contaminants absorbed in carbon. I'm going to touch on both of these questions during the presentation. My plan, and here's the agenda, my plan is to set the stage by briefly talking about ITRC and natural source zone depletion. I'll then journey into a diesel bench test performed at RPI's lab here in Golden, Colorado, and take what we learned from that and apply it to a large condensate LNAPL site that, and when I say large, this is a site that had a couple of different plumes, total area of about 130,000 square feet. And what we're going to find is that a lot of this just comes down to mass removal rates. So we'll see how they stack up. And ultimately, I think we'll find that the benefit is all about time and contaminants of concern. So let's just cut straight to the chase, and let's just start at the end. And I'll show you how the mass removal rates stacked up. And so the first entry, as you can see here, is an estimate of natural source zone depletion, mass removal rate. And the number that I've chosen is, or selected from the guidance document, is 2 grams of free phase per meter squared day. And if I normalize that to an annual basis, that becomes 730 grams per meter squared year. Then, if I take the mass removal rate that we're estimating at our large condensate site, that number is roughly 5,065 grams of free phase per meter squared year, roughly 7 times higher than the natural source zone depletion mass removal rate. Not to worry, I'm going to explain how we got to both of those numbers through the course of this presentation. But clearly on its face, it certainly appears that carbon in general and BOS200 in particular has a role to play in LNAPL sites. So I want to take a couple of minutes just to recognize and give credit to our ITRC and the people working in the LNAPL and natural source zone depletion groups for the great work that they've done, with contributions to our understanding of LNAPL coming from state UST offices, oil companies, professionals in the private sector, and countless others who worked in these groups. And in the past, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, ITRC used to offer a 2-day LNAPL class around the country, and it was an outstanding class. They currently offer it online. If anyone out there hasn't attended that class, I would highly recommend it. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned from that. So what was the ultimate result of all of this effort? And they provided us education in this class, and they also provided us guidance documents. And as I think most people are aware, there are 2 guidance documents that were updated just this last year. So natural source zone depletion. We learned in the LNAPL class, we learned about LNAPL and the importance of transmissivity. And when the transmissivity drops below a threshold level where it's no longer economical to continue to try to recover free product with mechanical systems, then natural source zone depletion has been getting an awful lot of attention as the logical next step for what we do after we've gotten what's practicable. And there are many different mechanisms here that are in play to support the natural source zone depletion, including leaching into groundwater, vaporization, biodegradation in the groundwater and BOS zone, just to name a few. We're not really here to talk about that. What's really important from all of this is mass removal rates. So what you're looking at now is a nomograph from the latest update from the natural source zone depletion guidance document. And you can see over on the left we have, and these are obviously this is logarithmic scales, but we can see the depth to the interface between the aerobic and the anaerobic zones in the subsurface. We all know that in the shallow soil we have oxygen that diffuses in, that's aerobic typically. As we get deeper, particularly on hydrocarbon contaminated sites, we begin to travel into the anaerobic zone. The lines here represent, as you can see from the log here, this one is clay, higher moisture content, and we have silt, clay with a lower moisture content, and then we also have sand and gravel. So if we think about these sites, and you can see on the top and the bottom we've got just mass removal rates. And on the bottom, this is going to be rates in grams per meter squared day, or gallons per acre year. But if you think about these petroleum sites, most of the sites and the removal rates, and this nomograph is just giving you estimated rates. And every site is different, so the rates vary all over the place. But for the most part, we're going to see those rates falling right into the center part of the graph here. And so for purposes of just discussion and comparison, that 2 that I chose came from right here. So now you can see where I got the number that I did in the previous slide that I showed you. And if you take 2 and multiply it by 365, that's where the 730 came from. So we'll file that away and remember where that came from. And now let's move on to this diesel bench that was done here at RPI. So the first thing I want to talk about is when it comes to doing a diesel bench, why is it so difficult? And this lists some of the primary reasons. Number one, diesel fuel is not very soluble in water. And in fact, based on work we've done here, roughly 100 ppm is full saturation at room temperature. There are, as we all know, very low levels of regulated VOCs. The benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene content in benzenes or in diesel is very, very low. So most of the diesel fuel is normal alkanes. There are branched alkanes as well. There is some aromatic content in it, but it's for the most part it's very low. The other difficulty is that even if I prepared a water solution, say 50 ppm of diesel fuel in water, a very small dose of activated carbon literally eliminates everything from the water. So you're only able to measure changes in anions and cations in the water. So this created, it's a problem, and it also created an opportunity, because what we decided is that the best way to do this would be to actually preload the activated carbon that's used to manufacture our BOS200 with diesel fuel, and then use that preloaded carbon in our bench test. And so the opportunity here is that it actually allowed us to measure the saturation absorption capacity of the carbon. And as we all know, there's rules of thumb out in the industry, and one of those rules of thumb is that activated carbon can absorb roughly 15 to 20% of its weight in organic materials, whatever those might be. That assumption has been used to essentially say, when it comes to LNAPL sites, that activated carbon doesn't have a role to play because you can't put enough of it in the ground. So let's just walk through the slide here so I can tell you how we went about this. So we took 1 liter bottles, we added water in there, then we put in our carbon and allowed that to mix for a couple of days. And the reason we did that was to fully saturate the pore structure of the carbon before we contacted it with any diesel fuel. Then we added some excess diesel fuel to the bottle and we mixed that for several days, again, to allow an equilibrium to take place. We took them off the mixer, allowed them to stand, so we had phase separation. We separated the free phase diesel from the water and the carbon. We vacuum filtered to isolate the carbon, and then finally the carbon was actually washed on the filter with cold methanol to remove any surface contamination. We then dried that in a desiccator, and stored it in amber glass. So, what did the analysis show? So, after we had dried the carbon, we then extracted everything that was on the carbon off so that we could measure how much diesel was on there. And what we found was that the coal-based carbons that RPI uses in its BOS200 are able to absorb 58 weight% of diesel fuel, which is 2 to 3 times what the industry thought the absorption capacity might be. So each gram of that carbon contains roughly 0.6 grams of carbon and 0.35 grams of diesel fuel. We, at the same time, did the same thing with some other carbons, and just to show you all carbons are not the same, here was the data from wood-based carbons. And the wood-based carbon was able to pick up 29 weight% diesel. This actually surprised me a little bit, because if anybody's looked at electron micrographs of wood-based carbon, the honeycomb structure, I thought, would allow absorption of a lot more weight of diesel fuel. But, and this is important, all carbons are not the same. So we then took measured amounts of that carbon that we preloaded, half-gram amounts, and used that in our study. And you can see the vials here. These are 150 ml serum vials. Sometimes what you can just visually see is informative, and you can see that some of these bottles are clear and some have a pinkish color and some are yellowish. And I can tell you that when we first assembled the bottles, they were all clear. We ran the test for about 6 months, as you'll see in a minute. But again, it's been known for a long time that metals can enter into these reactions as terminal electron. They can become oxidized, so their valence states can change. So the pinkish color probably came from manganese or cobalt, and the iron was, or the yellow probably came from iron. So we can see that there's been valence change states in the vials, and it's due to the biological activity. So they're participating in the degradation of the diesel fuel that's in there. And this has been known for a long time, but it's cool just to see this. Also, the biological activity, and this comes back to whether or not things are bioavailable in the pore structure of the activated carbon. And this is an actual photograph from one of those vials, and you can see that the carbon, the granular carbon that was in there, is just like fully encased in this viscous goo. Small grains are actually suspended in it, and it's just covered with all these bubbles. And this is from the biological activity. So talk about biofilm. There's a lot of biofilm that was formed here, a lot of gas generation, and in fact we had to vent pressure from these things several times over the course of the study. It's just really a cool photo, so I wanted to share that with you guys. So what happened in the bench test? So you can see that we started out, this is our preloaded carbon, times 0, and we're tracking our milligrams of diesel fuel, the change over time. And we ran the test, like I said, for 6 months, 180 days, and you can see the little points here these are data points where we actually sacrificed bottles, measured what was in the water, extracted everything off the carbon, and then looked at the data. So you can see here that we've got a very linear line. Here's the equation of that line. So here's our intercept, matches up pretty well with the initial amount of material. The correlation coefficient is very high. So you can see we're basically eliminating 85 milligrams of diesel fuel per day over the course of this test. So what's one of the really interesting things about this is that no matter what kind of kinetic model you look at, whether it's first order, second order, monad kinetics, in Cartesian space, all of those things plot out as curves, and yet we have a straight line here. So what this is really suggesting is that we have a linear relationship between the surface area of the carbon that's in the ground and the mass removal rate that we're seeing, as long as we can support the biological activity. And that opens up a whole new approach to looking at LNAPL sites. In the past, everybody was focused on the absorption capacity of carbon is inadequate to address these kind of sites. There's just so much mass there, you can't put enough in the ground. And that's a true statement. And the fact that activated carbon, at least the carbon that we use, has 3 times the absorption capacity of what people thought, doesn't change that. It's not economically feasible or realistic to really approach these sites and slam enough of this in the ground to just suck up all the mass that's there. The better way of looking at this is to look at it from a kinetics point of view. And that's what this is telling us, is that we now have a tool that we can use to actually start thinking about a timeline. So if we want to eliminate the NAPL that's there in 2 years, we can then turn that around and determine what the average loading needs to be in terms of the treatment on the BOS200 in order to achieve that. So we took this and we applied it to a site, a condensate site. Condensate, this particular condensate is actually very high in benzene. So here we have groundwater issues and free product issues. And as I said before, this was a very large site. It's about 8,800 square meters in size between 2 plumes. The total amount of BOS200 that was injected was 128,000 pounds. The average loading in terms of just grams of carbon per square meter is 5,065 grams of carbon. And if we take this mass removal rate that we had looked at and we normalize that to put that on a annual square foot or square meter rate, it comes right out to be about 1 gram of free phase per gram carbon per square meter year. So just multiply 1 times that number, our mass removal rate is 5,065 grams of free phase per meter squared year. That's where the other number came from. So now I've at least walked you through where the numbers came from in those slides. Now, let's see. So the next question would be to ask, so how are things going out on this site where we applied this technique, this design? It's a kinetic design, keep that in mind. And our prediction was, the design basis was that the NAPL on this site would be consumed over a period of roughly 18 to 24 months. So this is one of the recovery wells out on the site, and I can tell you injections began in late July of 2017 and they finished up in early December. So this particular area of the site was injected right around this point in time, so September of last year. So I'm showing you an awful lot of data, historical data. And you can see here on the left, this is the depth below ground surface. The blue line is actually depth to free phase, and the red line is depth to water. And we all know that there's a relationship between the depth to water and whether or not we actually see free phase in monitor wells. You can see from the plots here that this is an unusual well in that almost independent of where the groundwater was, we actually saw free phase in the past with one exception. And so we've continued on, and free phase has been in this recovery well all along. Then we injected, and we can see that groundwater went up, and just most recently it has dropped down, and yet there's no free phase there. The other thing that we noticed in this site was that, of course, we had benzene. So we looked at historical data. We looked at wells where free phase had been observed and free phase hadn't been observed, and compared that to the groundwater benzene value, and came up with a rough correlation that we felt we could use on the site. And the way that worked out is concentrations Once you reach a concentration of benzene between 50 and 100 ppb, then it's likely that you have groundwater in contact with free phase. And if it's below 50 ppb, then we're in a zone where it's unlikely that we're going to see free phase at that location again. So here's another one of those recovery wells, and I'm showing you just a plot of benzene, TVPH, and sulfate. When the injections are completed, the sulfate does spike. So you can see this is clearly where the injections took place. And you can see where the benzene was previously, baseline values of both benzene and TVPH. The benzene during the injections fell. This kind of response is very common when activated carbon is injected in the ground, where you see a drop and then a rise and then a downward trend. This is an LNAPL site, so when we injected the site, we put mechanical energy into the ground. So this spike in TVPH is perfectly reasonable. You can see that since the injections were completed, we've seen this downward trend in benzene. We're also seeing this downward trend in TVPH. We're also seeing consumption of sulfate. All of those things are consistent with activity going on at the site. So now I want to come back to that slide and talk about how they stack up. And true, the mass removal rate that I chose for the natural source zone depletion and that nomograph is just for estimation purposes. But I think that the 2 grams a day is probably a reasonably good number. And it might be a little bit higher, it might be a little bit lower. The mass removal rate that we're estimating here is originally coming from a lab study. Lab studies are kind of perfect. You can control all the variables. And so is our field mass removal rate going to be exactly that number? Is it likely to be higher? Probably not. But even if we were only 50% of that number, we're still several times faster than the mass removal rate that you're seeing from natural source zone depletion. So from these numbers, and it's clear that activated carbon, and BOS200 in particular, has a role to play on these sites. And we all know there's a difference between diesel and gasoline sites. Diesel doesn't really have a groundwater issue, so it makes a lot of sense to move into natural source zone depletion. But the temporal component to those cleanups they're not short, they're very long. So clearly we can accelerate that removal, the cleanup of the site, with the use of the activated carbon, the BOS200. The carbon is acting as a platform to support the biological activity. So I wanted to kind of wrap up on with a couple of things. One of which was just to share a portfolio of sites. So this RPI has been involved in treating LNAPL sites for a long time. And at this moment, we've done about 40 sites. Of those 40 sites, about 60% are closed. This large condensate site that I took data from, it is a kinetic design. We are predicting that NAPL will be depleted in 18 to 24 months. As of June of this year, out of 20 wells in the 2 plumes, 2 have measurable NAPL in them. 5 have benzene below the MCL. So in those areas, it's unlikely that we're going to see any NAPL reappear, regardless of what groundwater does. And 10 of those wells out there suggest that we still have submerged NAPL. None of this is surprising to me because it's a kinetic design. It's going to take time. Then I also wanted to point out we had been involved in a major site in Denmark, and the baseline NAPL was 1 to 5 feet of petrol, gasoline, in monitor wells. Now, we started working on this site about 5 years ago, and it's when the pilot test was first installed. And the pilot was studied for about 1.5 years before the site went to full scale. The full scale was then implemented, and I'm excited to say that the site has just yesterday received an NFA. the site has been cleaned up and met the goals that were set by the government agency. So, just recently, in April, as a matter of fact, I was at the Battelle conference and sitting in a session, and a very well-known gentleman got up and went to the mic at the end of the session to ask a question. And he made a statement, and his statement was, "I'm told by all of the experts in our company that for microorganisms to assimilate organic contaminants, that they have to be in the dissolved phase." And I wanted to share a review article with you guys that just came out in 2017. And in there, they described how biodegradation of oil constituents could occur without solubilization into the bulk groundwater. And so, based on this article, and I'm sure you're going to recognize some of the names of the authors in this article, it's beginning to be clear that it doesn't have to be dissolved. And so, again, this goes back to the bioavailability of things that are absorbed into the activated carbon and the fact that they can indeed be assimilated. And it doesn't have to be dissolved. There are mechanisms where the organisms can directly assimilate these things. So I'm leaving this up just for a couple of minutes so any of you who might be interested could jot down how to find that article. Kind of while I leave that up there, I'll take a look at some of the questions. One of the questions has to do with diesel having higher carbon chains in the material, and it's difficult to break the chain. It's absolutely true that more questions. It's absolutely true that there are longer chain hydrocarbons in the diesel fuel, and I was going to try to share some data. It's hard to look at chromatograms in a presentation like this, and there are some changes in that. What I'd like is, if this person that asked this question could email me, I could actually share some data with you. But we have seen that you don't just get degradation in the lighter fractions. We get degradation across the zone. And you are correct, the longer chain hydrocarbons do tend to take a longer period of time. And we've seen this same sort of effect for a long time in the industry. Another question has to do with electron acceptors. And we know there's an awful lot of mass in these LNAPL sites. So it takes a lot of electron acceptor in order to deal with that mass. So the question was, how do I get more electron acceptors into the subsurface when the original amount of acceptor is used up? And we actually can do that in a couple of different ways. Number one is, as people are probably aware, we use gypsum as a time-release source of terminal electron acceptor of sulfate over time. So that's one aspect of the sulfate. So when we did the treatment on these LNAPL sites, we put as much gypsum as we can in the ground. And then the other thing that we do is we prepare the slurries in a solution of either sodium or magnesium sulfate. So the sulfate concentrations are really high. We're talking thousands of ppm when we put those in the ground. In fact, what we do is we design the sulfate, the TDS, if you will, to be right up there towards the upper limit of what the bugs can tolerate. So then what happens is, initially, there's no demand on the gypsum. There's now a demand on the sulfate that's dissolved in the slurry, the water that the slurry was created in. So that sulfate goes away, and then as that's depleted, now the gypsum starts to kick in. So that's one way in which we've attempted to put additional terminal electron acceptor in. And then for those sites where if we see stall in the biological activity as a consequence of depletion of all of our terminal electron acceptors, I mean, the best way to then supplement that is to just go back out and we can either add a solution of mag or sodium sulfate through monitor well networks, or you can inject it. The cost for that kind of work is not high. So those would be the two ways, and hopefully I've provided you with enough information to understand how we try to address that question. Here's a question regarding the importance of inoculating BOS200 with our culture prior to installation and relying on indigenous species. So when the BOS200 is initially mixed in a mixing tank, it's stirred pretty vigorously, so you entrain air, and the air then contributes to dissolved oxygen. One of the characteristics of activated carbon, wet carbon, is that it sucks up oxygen. So the condition within the activated carbon when it's first injected is aerobic. And the indigenous bacteria that are floating around typically in a footprint of hydrocarbon contamination, that's an anaerobic state. So there are all facultative organisms around that could take advantage of it. But we needed a set of organisms, a blend of organisms that can take advantage of both aerobic conditions, because that's what's going to be present initially. Then as the oxygen is consumed, it then goes on, it trends down into an anaerobic state. And the game is being played inside the porous structure of the carbon. It's not being played out in the formation at large. So as that changes, we now need organisms that can take advantage of the anaerobic condition that they're dealing with. So the blend of organisms that we use and inoculate the BOS200 slurries with have organisms that can take advantage of those different conditions. So as a consequence, we're not going to be able to see the same sort of organisms in play, indigenous organisms. The other thing that we play on is the fact that we could rely on indigenous organisms, but then it would take a longer period of time to build up the bacterial counts. In this case, we're inoculating our BOS200 to the tune of about 5 times 10 to the 6 CFUs per gram carbon before it ever goes into the ground. Given that it's difficult to imagine that the niche is now occupied by these other organisms. So the indigenous organisms aren't really going to stand much of a chance. We've had an awful lot of good success with the blend of organisms we have, which is why we don't rely on indigenous bacteria. Let's see here. Here's one where people are asking, or this person is asking, the benefits of BOS200 over calcium peroxide or other oxidizing agents. Well, I mean, we've got a long history of oxidant use on hydrocarbon sites. And in persulfate, for example, the stoichiometry for oxidants is not very favorable, number one. The other aspect of oxidants is that you were faced with multiple installations. In the case of BOS200, in most instances, we're able to achieve the end goal with a single installation. Even if we had to add supplemental terminal electron acceptors, the platform still exists. It's still in the subsurface. So it's still there, ready to be utilized and support biological activity. So the biggest benefit of the BOS200 over time is that I don't have to go back out there 5 times and re-inject it. I can do it once and typically achieve my end result. Let's see. Here's a question related back to the bench test. It's where I mentioned that BOS200 was placed in bottles with water. was the diesel added to the test bottles as a free phase? No, it was not. If you recall during the presentation, I mentioned that we preloaded the carbon with diesel before we ever added it to the bottles. So there wasn't any free phase that was added. We did actually spike enough diesel dissolved in methanol to create about a 50 ppm dissolved diesel concentration in the water, so that we had something that we could measure in the water. So to answer your question, no, there was no free phase diesel that was added to the water. And we were, at least in the short term, we were able to measure a little bit of diesel in the water during the test, but the bacteria pretty well wiped that out early on in the game, and then what was left was just the mass that was on the carbon, which we monitored over time through extraction. See, here's a question. Most natural source zone depletion works through a fermentation of hydrocarbons to methane and carbon dioxide. You don't need an electron acceptor for the fermentation reaction to occur. And that's, I'm not a microbiologist, but I believe that's a true statement. The issue really is not whether or not natural source zone depletion is occurring. It is. And in fact, they measure, it's very common to measure the rates of degradation through CO2 traps and also methane. There's a variety of ways to look at estimating the mass removal rates, and CO2 and methane are just one or a couple of those ways of doing it. The point, and I think the real value that I'm trying to communicate, is the fact that the mass removal rates are quite different. So I believe, and I've been saying this for a long time, that BOS200 and activated carbon has a role to play in natural source zone depletion. That we need to think about that in a different way, not think about it in terms of an absorption property, but think about it in terms of kinetics, the mass removal rate. And so if we can come up with a system that complements natural source zone depletion and complements the mechanisms that are in play to conduct that, and shorten the timeline for cleanup on sites from decades to years, then that has value. And that's what I'm suggesting. Let's see here. Let me read. There's another question. This is a question regarding the condensate site where we implemented this kinetic design. And they're asking whether there's a plan to actually measure the mass depletion rates at that site. And yes, indeed, there is. We're going to continue to monitor that. We're working with a great consultant and a great client that's very interested in the progress on the site. So far, it's been looking really good, but we're early in the game. We're only 6 months in. In some places on the site, a little bit more than 6 months. So we are going to continue to monitor groundwater on a regular basis. We also, at some point, we haven't chosen exactly when that will be, but we hope to go back out and actually do soil sampling, so that we have, and we had extensive soil samples on the front end that helped us just develop the design, so we knew what the vertical distribution of mass was, as well as the aerial distribution. And we were looking at a threshold of 500 ppm, which we knew was just above the CSAT for hydrocarbons in the soils that we had down there at the site. So we've got a great, robust data set that we can use for baseline conditions to compare later. So there is indeed a plan to do that, and so stay tuned. Hopefully, maybe late this year or early next, we'll be able to come back and update people on the progress at that site. Okay, I think we're probably running out of time. I appreciate everyone's interest in the topic. Thank you very much for sharing some time with me this morning. I know you're all busy and time is money. And on that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Oh, any questions that people have that I either didn't get to or that you have that I haven't touched on, please feel free to email me or call me, and I'll do my level best to answer those questions. Again, I want to thank everyone who participated this morning. Have a great day.